Hey, in this video, I wanted to talk about the difference between crossing a horizontal asymptote and crossing a vertical asymptote. So this is a common misconception that students often run into because it is true that crossing a vertical asymptote is something we can't do. Now, because vertical asymptote sounds a lot like horizontal asymptote, it's natural to want to think that we can't cross a horizontal asymptote. That's actually something we can do. We can cross a horizontal asymptote. And we should be thrilled about this. It makes our functions more exciting. And in this video, we're going to talk about the fundamental reasons why that's the case. So we'll start with a word problem for car fuel economy. And actually, this is just going to be more of a graph. All right, so one of the ideas behind, car fuel economy, no one actually expects to get their car fuel economy. So I drive an Acura TSX. It's a 2007. It used to be my grandpa's. And it gets 27 miles per gallon. But I don't always get 27 miles per gallon. Particularly when I first start driving, I'm not getting 27 miles per gallon. That's because I'm going slow through a parking lot, often stopping and braking. So when I first start off, my fuel economy is pretty low. And then it gets even lower as I have to accelerate up to speed. So let's put some labels on this graph. Start to fill it in. Do this dotted line. This will be 27 mpg. And I'll label what I'm doing. So this is driving through a parking lot. The second section is getting up to speed. So that should be clear that when you're accelerating, your gas mileage is going down because your car is really working to get you up to speed. And then it shoots up a bit higher as I'm driving on the highway. And then often I'm getting on the 25 freeway. So this section where it's high is city driving. Then it's going to go down sharply and come back up. Let's keep filling in the detail here. So way to understand this. This is accelerate onto freeway. And now I like to drive fast from time to time. So maybe I went up to 80 miles per hour, but now I need to come back down to 60. So that's where my fuel economy gets really good. And we actually overshoot our eventual horizontal asymptote. So then it comes down as I drive normally and it starts to look like it's following the blue horizontal asymptote. And it changes from time to time, but it's pretty close. So this period is decelerating. And then I just put on cruise control and the car is just going. So this is kind of what happens where we have this 27 miles per gallon. That's our horizontal asymptote. And we did cross it. And there's nothing wrong with that. We can see that that's actually fine. That's what we'd expect to happen in this case. Yeah, so we cross the horizontal asymptote and there's no problem. This is going to be different than what happens in the vertical asymptote case. And for the vertical asymptote, it's going to be easier to look at a function. It's hard to find a lot of examples where vertical asymptotes come into play in the real world. So let's look at what's going on with this function. If you haven't already watched videos on how to graph rational functions, now would be a good time to do that because we're going to apply a lot of our skills from that. Now, our intuition tells us that, or not our intuition, our knowledge of rational functions tells us that we can't divide by zero, therefore zero has to correspond to a vertical asymptote. So we'll put a dashed line through the y-axis. That's representing our vertical asymptote. So that way we don't divide by zero. Now, we also know that from the top, we can see we have a root at 1. So when we plug in 1, we get 0. So we'll put a 0 there at 1, but we're not going to be too concerned about it with this example. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is figure out what our graph looks like. And we see that when we're dividing by a number close to 0, our function should be really large. Because if we take, like say, f of 0.01, so that's a number that's pretty close to 0. We get 0.01 minus 1, and we divide it by 0.01 squared. Well, that's negative 0.01. Sorry, not negative 0.01, negative 0.99 divided by 0.0001, which when we divide by that, we need to multiply by 1,000 to get back the top. And it gives us negative 999. So this is just normalizing the denominator to understand what our number is. So we get a very large, very negative number. So when we're close to 0, our function's way down here. Kind of see that maybe it should look something like this. And it will have a horizontal asymptote like that. Now, there's a good reason why we can't cross the vertical asymptote. And that's because that would correspond to two particular things happening. First, it would say that our function stops growing at some point for positive numbers. And that's just behavior we've never seen before. We know if we move closer and closer to 0, so we plug in an even smaller number, such as f of 0.001, we'll get even more, we'll get even larger numbers out. But if we were to cross, on the right-hand side, we would have stopped growing at whatever this point is, and then do a small jump to the other side. The other thing that would go wrong is then we still have to trend towards that asymptote. So our function would have crossed, and then would have to bend back. And we know that a function can't bend, at least not like that. It can't bend back on itself. So that's another thing that can go wrong if you have a function that tries to cross a vertical asymptote. So the only way to make this behavior work is if it doesn't cross. So it would have to look something like this. And again, on this example, we can see that we do cross the horizontal asymptote. So we had, if we go back to our knowledge of how to graph rational functions, we can see that the degree of the top is less than the degree of the bottom. So we know 0 is our horizontal asymptote. And we did cross it, and that's just fine. So this happens whether we're doing examples about cars or if we're just graphing functions. It's perfectly fine to cross a horizontal asymptote, but we cannot cross a vertical asymptote. All right, thank you for watching this video. I hope it was informative.